Saprolings are one of the oldest creature tokens in Magic the Gathering. They made their debut way back in 1994's Fallen Empires and have shown up with regularity ever since. While Saproling is a creature type, it's never shown up as a creature type on an actual creature card. It's only ever appeared on tokens, which makes it pretty unique. In all, there are 87 cards that create Saproling tokens in Magic, and in this video, we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. First tier top 8s are worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours. And second tier top 8s are worth 1 point. This includes events like Regional Championships. This is actually the second time I'm taking a look at Saprolings. I did it the first time way back in May of 2020, but the list has changed a lot in the last 4 years. So in addition to looking at the top 10, we're going to start by looking at the 4 cards that made the 2020 list, but got bumped off it this time, starting with Saproling Cluster, which was at number 10 last time. For 1 generic and a green, it's an enchantment that lets you pay 1 generic and discard a card to make a 1/1 Saproling token, and any player can use this ability. The symmetry here isn't awesome, as giving your opponent an extra ability certainly isn't ideal, but this does make Saprolings pretty efficiently, and the cluster gained all of its points in a standard combo deck that didn't really care whether the opponent could use it or not, because it could combo off and win the game. The deck, called Chimera, would tutor up Saproling Cluster along with Fecundity and Ashnod's Altar. With all 3 of those cards in play, you could discard a card to make a Saproling, and then sacrifice that creature to the altar, which gave you 2 mana and drew you another card. With every sacrifice, you would net 1 mana, so you would draw your whole deck and produce a ton of mana, and then use something like Whetstone to mill the opponent out. The deck was relatively short-lived, but it was a pretty sweet combo while it was around. Also, the art on this card shows you how frightening the earlier Saproling cards are. They just look like really toothy leeches or something. Anyway, the cluster gained all of its points way back in 2000, so obviously it didn't do enough to remain on the list. Next, there's Saproling Migration, which was at number 9 last time. For 1 generic and a green, it's a sorcery that makes 2 1/1 green Saproling creature tokens. It also has Kicker for 4 generic, which means you can pay that additional cost when you cast it, and if you do, you get 4 Saprolings instead. It gained all of its points in standard decks that could get tons of value out of tokens using Trostani Discordant and Venerated Loxodon. It hasn't gained any points since rotating out of standard. Next, there's Aura Mutation, which was at number 8 last time. For 1 green and 1 white, it's an instant that destroys an enchantment, and then you get X Saproling tokens, where X is that enchantment's mana value. If you have a target for this, it's pretty darn powerful, as taking away a permanent and getting several 1/1 bodies can be a major swing in the game. Aura Mutation might seem like a sideboard card, and in most standards it probably would have been, but the standard in the year 2000 had lots of powerful enchantments, like Fires of Yavimaya, Rising Waters, and Parallax Wave. As a result of the fact that basically every deck in the format had main deck enchantments, Aura Mutation was actually played in the main deck at Pro Tour Chicago in 2000, where it gained all of its points. Rith the Awakener is the last of the cards to make the 2020 list, but lose its spot this time, and it was at number 7 last time. For 3 generic, a red, a green, and a white, this legendary dragon is a 6/6 flyer, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you can pay 2 generic and a green and choose a color. If you do, you get a 1/1 Saproling token in play for each permanent of that color, so you're always going to get at least 1 Saproling, and you're usually going to be able to get more, and the effect can really snowball because if you just start naming green, you double your Saprolings every turn. Rith was played in standard Naya aggro decks where it was played at the top of the curve, but it hasn't top 8'd anything since 2000. Alright, now that we've covered the cards that made the list in 2020 but didn't make it this time, let's move to the top 10 proper, starting with Scatter the Seeds, which wasn't on the list last time. For 3 generic and 2 green, it's an instant that makes 3 1/1 Saprolings, and it has Convoke, which means you can tap creatures to help cast the spell, and each creature you tap while casting it pays for 1 generic or 1 mana of that creature's color. In other words, you can often spend a lot less than 5 mana to cast this, and obviously if you're in a deck making lots of Saprolings, you might even cast it for free. While it didn't make the list 4 years ago, it isn't on it now because it's a new card. Rather, it makes the list now because it started to see more play in Pauper, a format where only commons are legal, and that's where Scatter the Seeds has gained all of its points. It's played alongside cards that can get some sweet extra value out of tokens, like Glimmer Baron and Llanowar Stalker. It's likely to gain more points going forward and has a good chance at moving up the list. It also happens to have been an insane common in every limited format it's ever been part of. At number 9, it's Seed Spark, which was at number 6 last time. It's a Selesnya card from original Ravnica, and the Selesnya are probably the most Saproling-centric faction we've ever seen. This won't be the last Selesnya card we see on the list. For 3 generic and a white, it destroys an artifact or enchantment, and if you spent green mana to cast it, you get 2 1/1 Saproling tokens. So it's sort of like Aura Mutation. It lets you remove something and get some Saprolings. While it's more expensive and doesn't have the same ceiling when it comes to making those tokens, it can deal with 2 permanent types, and even if you destroy something cheap, you still get 2 Saprolings. Also, like Aura Mutation, Seed Spark was played in the main deck in Standard because the format had plenty of targets for it. This included powerful artifacts like Umezawa's Jite and powerful enchantments like Glare of Subdual, but Seed Spark hasn't top 8'd anything since 2005. At number 8, it's Namada Primeval Warden, a newcomer to the list that didn't exist back in 2020, since it was only printed in 2022's Dominaria United. For 2 generic, a black and a green, this legendary treefolk is a 3/4 with reach, and if a creature your opponent controls would die, it gets exiled and you get a Saproling. Namada also has 2 abilities that let you sacrifice Saprolings. One costs a single green and a single Saproling, and Namada gets +2/+2 until end of turn, and the other costs 1 generic and a black and 2 Saprolings, and you draw a card. Definitely the most Saproling-centric card on the list, since it not only makes them, it pays you off for having them. Namada gives you a Saproling engine that also hates on the graveyard, so if you're interested in killing your opponent's stuff a lot, it's pretty nice to have around. So it should come as no surprise that it gained all of its points in Jund and Golgari control decks in Standard. While it is still in Standard right now, it hasn't achieved a top 8 since 2022, so it might be done gaining points. At number 7, it's Vitu-Ghazi the City Tree, which was at number 5 last time. This land can tap for 1 colorless mana, or you can pay 2 generic, a green, and a white to make a 1/1 Saproling. This represents the headquarters of the Selesnya, so it makes sense that it makes Saprolings. Utility lands with good abilities are always nice. That's because early on they produce mana for you like any card would, but in the late game this can help you actually impact the board itself by making a Saproling token every turn if you have the mana lying around. In Standard, Vitu-Ghazi was an important enough card that there is a deck partly named after it, Ghazi Glare, which looked to use Glare of Subdual and various token-making cards to lock down the opponent's board every turn by tapping Saprolings. It hasn't gained any top 8 since 2006, though. At number 6, it's Selesnya Guildmage, which was at number 4 last time. It costs 2 green-white hybrid mana, and it's a 2/2, and it comes with 2 activated abilities. You can pay 3 generic and a green to make a Saproling, or you can pay 3 generic and a white to give your whole board +1/+1 until end of turn. Obviously, these 2 abilities can synergize together, as if you make a few Saprolings, the mass pump effect will be far more potent. Like Vitu-Ghazi, the Guildmage was played in Ghazi Glare decks, and it also found some success in Ravnica block Zoo aggro decks. However, it's been inactive since 2006. At number 5, it's Sprout Swarm, a newcomer to the list. Like Scatter the Seeds, it isn't here because it's a brand new card. It's here because it started to see a lot of play in Pauper over the last 4 years. For 1 generic and a green, it's an instant that makes a 1/1 Saproling, and it has Convoke, as well as Buyback for 3 generic. Buyback means you can pay that extra cost when you cast it, and if you do, the swarm goes back to your hand instead of into your graveyard when it resolves. Importantly, you can use Convoke to help pay for Buyback. So while the swarm doesn't have the same raw Saproling output as Scatter the Seeds, if you have enough creatures around, you can just cast this repeatedly, so it makes more Saprolings over the course of a game. It sees play in several different decks in Pauper, including mono-green aggro and more token-focused decks alongside Scatter the Seeds, but it's also played in Wall Combo, which looks to combo off and produce infinite mana by untapping Axebane Guardian repeatedly, and Sprout Swarm is a pretty good win condition when you have infinite mana. It's going to keep seeing play in Pauper going forward, and it's got a good chance at one day being the number 1 card on the list. Also, like Scatter the Seeds, this is insane and limited. At number 4, it's Saproling Burst, which has fallen 1 spot since 2020. For 4 generic and a green, it's an enchantment with fading 7. This means it enters with 7 fade counters and you remove 1 every upkeep, and if you reach the point where you can't remove 1, you sacrifice the burst. You can also remove a fade counter from it to make a Saproling token with power and toughness equal to the number of fade counters on the burst. That's right, Saproling Burst is a bit of an odd duck, because it creates a unique Saproling token instead of the 1/1 that every other Saproling card produces. If Saproling Burst leaves play, you have to destroy all the tokens created with it. So you can go a couple of different routes here. You can use the Burst to just make 1 big token, or you can make an army of them, if that will be better. In Standard, it was played in Fires of Yavimaya decks. In general, these decks ran lots of things with fading because it decreased the downside of the mechanic. This is because it gives your creatures haste so they can attack right away, allowing you to get more value out of your fading cards than normal. With Fires of Yavimaya in play, Saproling Burst was effectively a 5-mana 6/6 Saproling with haste, a completely insane creature in the early 2000s. You could also go for 2 5/5s with haste, which was often even better. Obviously, the tokens get weaker over time, but they did so much damage so quickly, didn't really matter. The Burst was successful in both block and standard, but it hasn't top-8'd anything in the last 23 years. At number 3, it's Fungal Infection, which wasn't on the list at all last time. For 1 black mana, it gives a creature -1/-1 until end of turn and makes a 1/1 Saproling. That's a pretty good rate, especially when you can use the -1/-1 to kill something. You can also potentially weaken a creature and use the Saproling to block it to take down something with 2 toughness. It's sort of like Scatter the Seeds and Sprout Swarm. It isn't a card that got printed over the last 4 years. It just started to see more play in Pauper. It had a couple of points back in 2020, gained in standard control decks, but it really started to take off in Pauper in 2023 when it started to get played in one of the better decks in the format, Golgari Garden. This is a black-green control deck that is built around generating 2-for-1s, and it often does this with cards like the Infection, which removes something up front, but then you can also sacrifice the token to Deadly Dispute or something similar, at which point you're way ahead. Fungal Infection is very likely to continue moving up the list in the future, especially because the 2 cards in front of it haven't gained a single point in a very, very long time, like the number 2 card, which is Verdant Force, which was also at number 2 last time. Probably the most iconic Saproling card of all time, Verdant Force is 5 generic and 3 green for a 7/7 that makes a 1/1 Saproling at the beginning of each upkeep. Unlike most upkeep triggers, this is one that happens on every upkeep, including your opponent's. This makes it generate Saprolings very quickly, and usually means you're going to get at least 1 before your opponent ever has a chance to remove it, and if they don't, they're going to lose in a hurry. Back in the late 90s and early 2000s, Verdant Force was one of the game's most powerful creatures, and it was often a reanimation target in Standard and Extended. These days, there are better reanimation targets around, but the Force's multi-year dominance in 2 formats has allowed it to come in at number 2 on this list despite not gaining a single point in 21 years. And at number 1, it's Sprouting Thrinax. For 1 black, 1 red, and 1 green, it's a 3/3, and when it dies, you get 3 Saprolings. That makes it pretty darn efficient, and it's challenging for your opponent to ever deal with it conventionally without ending up way behind. It gained all of its points in standard Jund decks between 2009 and 2010. These decks had great mana, so casting it was very easy, and they also tended to feature a bit of a sacrifice sub-theme, so getting 4 bodies out of a single Thrinax was extra sweet. Like many of the cards on the list, though, the Thrinax hasn't gained any points in a very long time, so it's very likely that Saproling cards already on the list, or new Saproling cards in the future, will overtake it by the time I revisit this list next time. So those are the top 10 Saproling cards. Do you want to build a Saproling army? Then check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past top 10s, including more that look at creature types, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron, and you can find ways to do that in the description. Thanks for watching.